Welcome to Strategy Talk, where the editors of Strategy Page discuss current events with a splash of history. I'm Dan Masterson, host of Strategy Talk. With me today is the editor of Strategy Page, well-known military author and game designer Jim Dunnigan. Also joining us is the associate editor of Strategy Page, columnist and author Austin Bay.
Jim, winter is approaching in Ukraine. I checked the weather reports last night. It's hovering around 32 degrees in the highs, but in January it's going to drop into the 20s. What is the effect of winter going to be on the Russians in Ukraine?
Well, it's going to hurt them because they're not getting the winter clothing, and the Ukrainians are still. They have basically people inside the occupied territories. They have daily updates from the American satellite systems and various other forms of intelligence, and they basically know more about the Russian situation than the Russians do. Now, we've already discussed earlier that the Starlink satellite system gives them better communications inside of the combat zone. The Russians are still basically facing the problem where the troops can't talk to each other, as it were, over the radio because they haven't got radios, or their radios don't have the range or the reliability of what the Ukrainians have. You got to remember that between 2014 and 2021, the Ukrainians absorbed, how to fight, like NATO. And like Western, giving initiative to low-level commanders, basically set up, mission statements. This is what we want to do. Lower commanders, if you meet some kind of problem, you basically improvise and keep going, and that's worked. The Russians are still stuck with their Soviet, style tactics. Ukrainians are well aware of that, and they're taking advantage of it. And the other biggest problem the Russians have is they don't have the supplies. They don't have the winter clothing. They don't have many armored vehicles left. They don't have top attack missiles like the Javelin or most American missiles that are hit from the more vulnerable top of the tank, and so the Ukrainians have basically superior armored vehicles, and the Ukrainians basically held off on launching their counteroffensive until they trained a lot of people. So they have better trained, more experienced troops, more of them attacking basically Russians who are reduced to largely these recently mobilized, conscripted soldiers who were given little training, and they just felt that, well, hey, we can put warm bodies in there, put these guys on the defensive, but they found out in many areas these troops don't even stand up much when they're under defense. They'll just run, and they've given their officers, the power to shoot, shirkers, as it were. Well, that doesn't really work because the Russian troops will just shoot back. So they have a real morale problem and command problem. They've got a few, dependable units, but they're few and far between. A lot of them are basically recruited from prisons by the Wagner Group, but this basically backfired to a certain extent when it turned out that the amnesty the Wagner Group is offering would not be honored by Russia, would not be appreciated. You're not going to turn these killers, loose, once their service as it goes is over. So the Russians are basically fighting, with a very weak force against a larger, better trained, better equipped, and better led Ukrainian force. It's all going to be revealed, as it were, how effective this is, in the next, 60, 30 to 90 days, because they are trying to scrounge up, trained replacements, which takes time, and they've got some of those undergoing training. But they've run out of armored vehicles they can depend on. They've run out of everything, and the Ukrainians have very cleverly, constantly attacked their supplies, their stockpiled supplies for their troops. This includes, not just clothing and ammunition, but also food. So the Russian troops are still, they keep their cell phones even though they're not supposed to, and the Ukrainians, overhear a lot of these conversations back home, and they release some of them, just to annoy the Russians commanders even more. The guys complaining, we've got nothing. We don't get rations. We don't get winter clothing. So it's a real problem for them. And like I say, if the Ukrainians can take advantage of this in the next, like I say, 60 to 90 days, they can basically take Crimea and even make headway in the Donbass, where they've reconquered a lot of territory. And the Russian attacks there, that's where a lot of their offensive people were, constantly fail. I mean, their advances are measured in meters. They basically don't make much headway, and they lose a lot of people, and that's bad for morale. So it's an opportunity with a time limit on it, and so what you should watch for is rapid advances by the Ukrainians, especially towards the small corridor that leads into Crimea, which they also already have under fire because they took Kherson, and they're basically taking control of the estuary of the Dnieper, or Dnipro as the Ukrainians call it, river. And once they have that, they'll have control of the river. The United States has sent them some patrol boats with armor on them, basically lightweight armor, but it gives them protection against fragments and machine guns and what have you. And these are being used aggressively. The Russians that abandoned Kherson, they basically skedaddled more effectively than they did up in Kharkiv, where they just ran and left a lot of equipment for the Ukrainians. They got that across the river. But the Ukrainians are basically showing that they can get across the river, and they're using their artillery to basically drive the defenders on the other side of the river away. And they got boats, and that enables them, especially at night, to send troops on the other side to establish a bridgehead, and then drive the Russians back more. So the Russians right now have nothing but disadvantages. And like I say, that's not going to turn around for maybe another 90 days, early 2023. So the Ukrainians have a basically one-time opportunity to make a lot of progress. And if they don't basically take a lot of territory, the Russians will basically be in much better shape, come early 2023.
Austin, what's the equipment situation for the Ukrainians and the Russians for the winter?
Well, Dan, I started following the preparations for winter, what I could find in the open source press, really in summer, and it was clear the Ukrainians were already preparing to fight in the winter war. A lot of the material I read came through the British Ministry of Defense, and their sources were back in Ukraine. But the Ukrainians were pushing NATO nations to supply them with winter clothing, primarily for soldiers, but also winter equipment. And I noticed in one report that the Ukrainians were looking for some of the starters to help warm up engines or keep auxiliary generators to keep equipment so that it could run with trucks and certain kinds of armored vehicles. They were asking for this equipment because if you're going to fight in the cold, you need it, especially if you're going to sustain the fight. At the same time, there were reports that Russians didn't even have standard summer or fall clothing for their soldiers. And a lot of those reports were not just Russian prisoners, but also listening to phone calls from Russian soldiers in Ukraine back to their parents or their family, complaining about lack of basic clothing as well as food and medicine. And since then, the Ukrainians have, this actually starts in the early summer, but the Ukrainians start getting supplies of longer range artillery rockets and tube artillery munitions so that they can interdict Russian and destroy Russian supply depots that are within, let's say, 40, 60, 70 kilometers of the front line. And they were targeting them, stop Russian ammunition, particularly Russian artillery ammunition and troop concentrations, but also supply depots where you would have the clothing, food, and medicine. And they've been consistently attriting Russian supply depots. Again, that's not just based on reports from NATO ministries of defense. That's appeared in open source reporting, Reuters, Agence France Presse, and the like. And there's lots and lots of video of Russian forward supply depots being interdicted. Just a quick aside on that. That's one reason the Ukrainians are desperately want to get longer range rockets like Army ATACMS, because now they can hit with an ATACMS, which you can fire from an MLRS launcher. You get targets 300 kilometers deep, and there are certain kinds of modifications that you can go further than that, so that the Ukrainians could hit Russian depots theoretically inside Russia, with at least close to the Ukrainian-Russian border. The point about being prepared for winter, though, is that the Russians, all the reports say that the Russian military forces in Ukraine are not prepared to fight a winter war. Now, vehicles, Jim brought up the earlier Russian tank models, T-62, T-72, earlier T-72s that are better able to fight in the winter in snow and freezing conditions. Look, I think the temperature right now in most of Ukraine is hovering around 0 degrees Celsius, which is freezing, 32 degrees of Fahrenheit. Typically, Ukraine, you're going to get sub 0 Celsius. It'll drop to minus 15, minus 17, minus 17, minus 18 Celsius is 0 degrees Fahrenheit or close to it. And it'll drop there and stay there for periods of time. That can actually be good for mechanized operations, vehicles with operating on treads, because you can get off roads if it's frozen ground and operate off road, as long as you're not in deep snow. A couple of feet of snow, okay, but when they've done deep snow, if they get 10 feet, it's next to impossible. It is impossible to operate military units in snow that deep. That said, there are specific vehicles that the Norwegians and U.S. forces in Alaska and the Swedes have that can handle even harsher conditions. But those aren't typical. Russians don't have them, and the Ukrainians are prepared for fighting in the cold. But if it freezes and that you don't have huge snow buildup, now you can get off the road if you're very, very careful. And here's the other part of it: you have armored and mechanized troops that are trained to not just operate their own vehicle in cold conditions, but operate as military units in formations, and that's extremely tricky. I know that's one of the points that if you've played some of SPI's old Eastern Front games, you wondered why everything slowed down in the winter, and that was what it was representing. That it was next to impossible to fight a maneuver war in those in harsh conditions in Russia and in Ukraine. Jim points out that the Ukrainians have an opportunity. He's suggesting to drive right to the at least edge of the Crimean Peninsula, perhaps shove the Russians out of most of the occupied areas by spring, Jim? Is that what you were saying? I think it's going to be more of a slow slug match during winter, especially when it goes back to 32 degrees Fahrenheit or 34 degrees, and you start getting slush, and you're not going to be moving vehicles. It's hard to dig out an emplacement for an artillery field piece in the mud and the muck. It's just hard to move, and it's just hard to survive. So, welcome to war, winter war in the East.
So, Jim, what is the equipment replacement situation for the Russians?
Grim. They were not able to replace their thousands of tanks they lost early in the war. And the Ukrainians basically didn't commit a lot of tanks early in the war. The Ukrainians now have their tanks, operational. Another thing to consider in the southern Ukraine around Kherson is it's dry in the wintertime. There isn't much rain, and it's cold. So for a while, at least until they get inside Crimea, they have the advantage. Now, if they get inside Crimea, that means their MLRS launchers are going to be there too, and they'll basically be able to hit all over Crimea. And of course, the Russians won't be able to get any supplies. They get limited supplies, through the damaged Kerch Strait Bridge. But they have to be careful trying to use ships. Because the Ukrainians have anti-ship systems. They have their attack boats, the robotic, remotely controlled attack boats, and they also have long-range UAVs they make themselves that can basically go several hundred kilometers and deliver a bomb load. So the Russians are at a disadvantage right now, and the period of where they are at disadvantage, will last for another, 30 to 45, into early 2023. So the Ukrainians are going to take advantage of this early on, and if they do get into Crimea proper, it's warmer in Crimea. Crimea indeed used to be a winter resort for a lot of Russians. It was warmer because they're surrounded by water, and it's simply warmer down there. But at that point, they can cut off the any supplies the Russians are getting in there, so the Russian forces in the Crimea will basically be unsupplied and at a disadvantage in terms of weapons and quality of troops. You got to remember that the Russians ran out of willing fighters, troops, in the last few months. They had this mobilization. Which basically, caught whoever they could catch. And these guys were not equipped. They were often not trained. And they basically melt away. Even on the defense, they will basically surrender or run because they simply are not trained or equipped to deal with, the attacking Ukrainians. So the Ukrainians have a window of opportunity that'll last, until the end of the year, or maybe a little longer, in which they can take back the Crimea and also make progress in the Donbass, where they have been making some progress, but that's the only place where the Russians have been attacking and basically just wasting their troops. They have some good troops, but they're in short supply, and they're mostly concentrated there. The Ukrainians are already using artillery attacks to push back the troops that were evacuated from the Ukrainian side, the left side of the Dnieper River, and they basically had them dig in and what have you. But the Ukrainians have basically used their artillery, and they've started, making preparations to use, boats they have to get troops across, establish a beachhead, and basically, advance, into the rest of, the Kherson province. That will basically allow them to cut off any land routes, into the Crimea, and also basically, drive the Russians away from the Black Sea coast, which is catastrophic for the Russians because, that was always their ace, as it were, in terms of, getting supplies to Crimea and using their naval power, which is much diminished. They've moved a lot of their warships out of Crimea because of they don't know, which of them are vulnerable to Ukrainian attacks, not just by the HIMARS missiles, which have a range of only about 80 kilometers, but the Ukrainians have built their own UAVs as cruise missiles and are using them. The Russians have also made arrangements with Iran to build the 136 cruise missiles, the ones they've been pounding the Ukrainian infrastructure with. But that production won't get going until early 2023. The Iranians apparently having second thoughts about sending them missiles because the Israelis have let it be known that if the Iranian missiles end up being used against Ukraine, the Israelis will supply the Ukrainians with missiles, and that could involve like the Laura missile, which has a range of 400 kilometers. And that's a ballistic missile, and maybe other missiles as well. The Israelis are primarily interested in punishing Iran, and so Iran has to basically calculate how much punishment can they take, and by aiding the Russians in Ukraine. Already there is talk of imposing the same kind of economic sanctions on Iran, which are already heavily sanctioned, that the Russians are under, and that would hurt the Iranians. They're still undergoing over 2 months of popular demonstrations, which aren't slowing down against the government. So the Iranians have their problems at home, and so the aside from getting some artillery ammunition from North Korea, the Russians don't have much, additional weapons and ammunition coming in. So, like I say, the Ukrainians have a window of opportunity. It's a question of how well they can take advantage of it, before the end of the year.
Austin, does Putin survive all of this?
We've speculated about this before, Dan, and it's.
Yeah, but I know you follow this, and so I'm hoping for some good intel here.
Well, first of all, don't have intel into the center of the Kremlin. There are indications that the Ukrainians and British do, but then again, of course, what is let out open source is something that can be scrubbed or slanted, and because there are rumors every day of potential action to remove Putin, to assassinate him. Some of these, I'm sure they're real rumors, but whether there is a movement afoot to actually carry it out in Russia, your guess is as good as mine. I don't think he can politically survive the loss of Crimea. Now, I think that is a sure thing if the Ukrainians retake it. I'm not sure he can politically survive the loss of the occupied regions in the Donbass, and then that little region that's in northeastern Ukraine that pro-Russian forces and some Russian forces still occupy. Winter is going to be extremely harsh on everybody, which was the point I was trying to make when I was first talking about how operations slow down, especially motorized, mechanized operations. But even just for well-trained infantry that knows how to handle the cold, everything is slow and arduous. You really go back, and I'm thinking about our training in Germany in the mid-70s, 75, 76, 77. You learned that the reason you had to put your socks underneath into your armpits, your wet socks, to dry them out, because you're going to have to change them so you don't get trench foot. And even the NCOs would say, yeah, we're practicing being miserable because you read about the Battle of the Bulge. We're not going to get caught again and have all the trench foot casualties we had and cold weather casualties. You can train for that, and you get inured to it, but you have to train for it. And then you train for it also to operate not just your own survival, but so you can operate as a combat unit. That's going to degrade the Russians, I think, more than the Ukrainians, and that's kind of what Jim is talking about when he says the Ukrainians have some tactical and operational opportunities in the winter. So I'm go back and repeat what I said. I don't see any successful long-range mechanized, motorized operations there. I'd be surprised because say the Ukrainians gain real firepower superiority with the MLRS and various armed UAVs and tube artillery. And then they could you could see some successful local advances by infantry forces that are prepared to fight in the cold versus the Russian soldiers that are not prepared. And for example, talking about how Wagner Group is now employing prisoners freed from Russia. Guys like that don't have the discipline to do what they need to do to stay in the fight when it's cold. They barely have the discipline to do it when they're being fed and it's warm. And there'll be one or two, but for the most part, no. Those guys are looking for a chance to surrender or run away or shoot their own officers. That again contributes to what Jim says, that the Ukrainians have an opportunity. So to get back to your question, there are a lot of things going wrong for Vladimir Putin, Dan. A lot of things. Even the weather's against him right now.
Well, we'll wrap it up there, and we'll follow this as winter progresses and becomes colder. I'm sure Jim and maybe even you, Austin, will be writing articles on this as we go through the winter. As we've got a lot of great content on the site about Ukraine and what's going on there. So hopefully people stay tuned. We'll see you next time.
Bye, guys.
Take care.